Ooh, what do we have here? Another scrumptious young plaything straight out of life and into my club? You smell new, little boy. Like fabric softener dew on freshly mowed astroturf. I'm not frightening you, am I, duckling? I can tell you and I are going to get along just like fire hoses.
In 1975, film critic Laura Mulvey wrote an essay that has continued to resonate with gender studies professors and sex-negative feminists ever since. The essay drew upon the work of Sigmund Freud and was called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. In it, Professor Mulvey introduced the idea of the male gaze. Her stated purpose in doing so was, as she put it, analyzing pleasure or beauty destroys it. That is the intention of this article. The key elements of Ms. Mulvey's male gaze theory can be summed up in 2 bullet points. First, that cinema is predominantly phallocentric. That is, it favors depicting the world as men would like to see it. The visual arts arise primarily from a patriarchal perspective and then serve to reinforce it. Viewers of a film are presumed to be heterosexual men, and everything that is shown on screen is aimed at providing visual pleasure for them. This tendency is especially apparent when the camera lingers over a woman's body or emphasizes her beauty. Second, that the process of doing this disempowers and objectifies the woman. The camera represents the active subject, and the woman represents the passive object. Hence, women are, to use the parlance of the theory, subordinated into being lesser beings through the act of being looked at. And it is important to note that this can be done both consciously or unconsciously, with women being compelled to participate even when they are not aware. Over the years, a great deal has been said and written about the theory of the male gaze. Many professors, including Ms. Mulvey, have continued to explore the nuances of this theory. For example, in 1992, she framed the notion of feminine beauty as being primarily something that is culturally defined by patriarchal constraints when she said, "In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly." And academic disciples of Ms. Mulvey, such as Professor Jonathan Schroeder, have emphasized the alleged dynamics of subordination when he said, "To gaze implies more than to look at. It implies a psychological relationship of power in which the gazer is superior to the object of the gaze." This theory of the male gaze has become a staple of gender studies courses, and entire academic curricula are built around exploring it in considerable detail. But for all the discussion and hours of coursework, the theory always returns to these 2 key elements: that the male gaze is a subconscious manifestation of the patriarchy in the visual arts, and that the male gaze subordinates women to a lesser status. If you understand these 2 elements, you've got the basic gist of the theory. Everything else are footnotes and long-winded examples. By boiling it down to these 2 components, I just potentially saved you thousands of dollars in college credits. You're welcome. Before continuing, however, it is crucial to note that, even though a whole lot has been written about it, the male gaze does not, in any way, qualify as a scientific theory. It isn't backed by studies or data. There is no actual proof that the act of looking at a woman, be that in art or in reality, diminishes her. Instead, the concept of the male gaze is more akin to a framing device. It is an ideological filter that students are encouraged to use when examining the visual arts. It is, ultimately, more opinion than fact. Not surprisingly, not all feminists agree with Dr. Mulvey's idea.
This idea of the male gaze, and they use this That's, woman is treated as object, passive.
It's Laura
He's the
Mulvey's
agent.
idea.
Exactly.
From the 1970s. Okay, and it absolutely, it just polluted film criticism. And Laura Mulvey is a very nice person. I've met her at the British Film Institute in London.
I think she's changed a little bit.
But she knows nothing about the visual arts. Okay? You cannot just, wade into film criticism and start talking about the male gaze without knowing something about the history of art, okay, and of perspective and of vision and so on. Okay, the male gaze is a foolish idea. Should have long ago been discarded.
However, with so much emphasis being placed on the male gaze theory, it should come as no surprise that feminist critics have brought it with them to their analyses of video games. As I've examined those analyses, I've identified 5 common complaints leveled against some video games that are derived from this ideological male gaze framing device. Let's take a quick look at each of these complaints in turn and see how they withstand a little informed scrutiny. The first complaint, that video games exploit women for male visual pleasure, seems to be missing a key aspect of game development. With very rare exception, there aren't any actual real women depicted in games. And no real men for that matter either. Instead, video game characters are entirely fictional in their creation. They are made up of graphic images, or, in the case of 3D representations, crafted out of polygons. These polygons are generally put into a mesh, and then the components of that mesh are attached to an underlying skeleton, or rig. That rig is then used to move the attached polygons around. Overlaid on top of the polygonal mesh is a texture map that represents stuff like skin and clothing. The computer then renders all this out in real time at somewhere between 30 to 60 frames each second. As developers, we are keenly aware that our creations are really just polygons being put to work by the game engine. Sometimes we even joke about it by saying things like, "That's an attractive group of polygons right there," or "Check out the polys on that model." Over time, the polygonal representations have become increasingly detailed and realistic. But the point here is that the complaint of exploitation doesn't really hold up too well when you acknowledge that there aren't any actual humans present to be exploited. Sure, the polygons might be arranged to look pretty for the viewer, but no living person or entity is being harmed in the process. Without an actual victim, there is no actual exploitation. The second common complaint is that video games are contributing to unrealistic beauty standards by portraying women as being preferentially slender with thin waists and large breasts. While it is true that the polygons of both women and men tend to be crafted by digital artists such that they are maximally attractive to the player, one should ask whether those beauty standards are something that the gaming industry is artificially creating, or are they merely reflecting the natural world? Or, in other words, are beauty standards something that are culturally constructed, or are they rooted in biology? In answer to that question, we can see that, for the most part, female beauty standards transcend both cultures and time. What makes for a pretty face in, say, Shanghai would also generally be considered similarly attractive in London. Furthermore, what is considered attractive from hundreds or even thousands of years ago is still generally considered attractive today. While there may be some variance, beauty standards prove to be consistent and reliable. Features such as youth, facial symmetry, and a waist-to-hip ratio of around 0.7 are not just commonplace, but universal in that they transcend time and culture. The evidence overwhelmingly shows us that such standards originate in nature, not in society. So, video games aren't telling us what to find beautiful or sexy. They're merely mirroring what we already instinctively know. The third complaint is that video games present players with systems of normalcy. The hypothesis is that prolonged exposure to video games will lead to gamers becoming confused between what is fantasy and what is reality. That if polygonal women in video games are frequently presented as being sexualized or as dressing provocatively in the gaming universe, then eventually gamers will start to think that this is how women are expected to dress, act, or behave in the real world. This complaint is what leads some feminist critics to complain that lingerie is not armor, and games shouldn't indulge in such outlandish costumes lest gamers start to get any wrong ideas. This complaint relies entirely on the presumption that gamers are, or will eventually become, unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. This notion of the presumed imminent danger of confusing fantasy with reality is also used as the justification for why violence in games is potentially harmful. A strong counterpoint to this argument is simply to point out that video games, like many other forms of entertainment, tend to celebrate their fantastic nature. The worlds that game characters tend to inhabit are filled with things like orcs and trolls, aliens and angels, vampires and werewolves, or demons and dragons. So if a player is having difficulty distinguishing fact from fantasy, that's probably not due to the game. Much more likely, that would be due to his or her mental health. Fourth, critics complain that sexualized female characters in video games will eventually cultivate sexist attitudes among their players. The word cultivate is deliberately chosen as it reflects the concept of the cultivation theory of media. The idea here is that extensive exposure to ideas or representations via media gradually changes the perception of the viewer in subtle and abstract ways. So while it may be true that gamers can still distinguish fantasy from reality, their underlying attitudes are secretly being shaped in insidious ways. Or, in other words, that players may not think that they are being consciously affected, but at a subconscious level, they actually are. Unfortunately for proponents of this complaint, a careful study by the European Research Council based on this cultivation theory of media found no link between sexist attitudes and video game play. To date, this is the largest and the best study on the subject. It was independently funded and covered a sample set of over 4,500 gamers across the span of 3 years. It was also published in 2014, which predates much of the current moral panic surrounding alleged sexist dangers in video games. One is led to wonder if such complaints could have been mollified before they gained traction, if only the complainants had done a few minutes of research first. Fifth, and finally, we have the complaint that some video games have been designed to appeal specifically to a heterosexual male audience, and hence, those games may include lots of pretty polygons. Well, unlike the other common complaints, this one appears not only to be valid, but to be painfully obvious. Indeed, one might wonder why this observation should be considered a complaint at all. Young, heterosexual male gamers constitute a sizable demographic of the game-playing public. It makes sense that anyone looking to make money from their game development efforts would give due consideration to that lucrative market.
I think this must be primal. Bigger boobs just yield more satisfaction.
So, the real question here is, why does this observation that there is a heterosexual male market for games get recast as a complaint? Is there something inherently or morally wrong with being a part of that market? Or is this complaint, perhaps, less about the content of the video games being criticized and more about male heterosexuality and its presumed ills? Are said complaints targeted more at shaming straight males for what they find appealing than at genuinely improving things for women in society? In relation to these questions, here are a few relevant points worth considering. First, Although the heterosexual male market constitutes a significant portion of the total dollars spent on video games, the number of titles released annually that cater specifically to this audience is relatively small. Second, demographic surveys show that roughly half of all the people playing games now are women. This strongly suggests that women are doing just fine at finding games that appeal to their interests. And not surprisingly, those games are often different ones than those targeting young heterosexual males. Indeed, we can readily find many games that have been specifically created to cater to that female market. Entire genres, such as Match 3, Hidden Object, or Nurturing and Growth, have predominantly female audiences. These types of games are just as valid and just as popular with their target female markets as are anything aimed at heterosexual males. The evidence shows that nobody is being excluded and that the markets are serving everyone. Third, note that products that cater to sexualities other than heterosexual males rarely face significant criticism for their mere existence. In fact, they are often celebrated. For example, consider the popularity of romance novels, or the appeal of films like Magic Mike, or the Vegas show, The Thunder from Down Under. Nobody seems to be advocating for a moral panic regarding these forms of entertainment. Which brings us full circle to ask the question, what does the existence of these other markets mean for the validity of the male gaze?
And it's not as if in gay culture we don't find the male gaze. I mean, gay males enjoy looking at pictures of beautiful, idealized.
And gay, and there you have just disproved this stupid theory, okay? Because gay men know when they look at a beautiful young man, okay, that they are not creating some sort of powerful subordination, okay, on that man, okay. They know they're looking up in admiration at that beauty, okay. This has been part of Western art since the Greeks.
And it's how.
In summary, it is clear to anyone honestly investigating the impact of alleged sexism in video games that there's really not too much to be concerned about. Using a fancy invented term like the male gaze doesn't make arguments against games created for a straight male market any more valid or compelling. So in the end, play what you like without shame, and game on, my friends.